Hey everyone, it's That Guy in Hutch, Jason Probst, and you're listening to That Podcast in Hutch. I'm real excited to continue this series on property taxes and trying to dive in and get a bigger understanding of what is all involved in property taxes and what's driving the prices up and how it affects local government and radical ideas. And we've had these conversations. So tonight I invited my friend Chris Courtwright in. I worked with him a little bit when I was in Topeka. He served for 34 years as the chief economist to the Kansas Legislature. In that role, he was responsible for leading the team that made projections about what state revenues would be. They do that twice a year. That's basically what the state builds its budget on. He would also work on what they call runs, but it would be looking at what a policy would do and what it would mean financially and create fiscal notes around these things. Chris has so much information, an incredible amount of information, not just about the structure of property taxes and actually all taxes, but also just the economics of state government and the history. And that's what I always appreciate when I talk to him is the history of this, because he brings in all this knowledge. He's seen the changes. He's seen different legislatures try different ideas. He remembers when one policy came in and it changed things, and he saw the effects and the after effects of that over the years to where they had to do another policy to change and make up for the policies that had been done before. So I have a nice conversation here, a real long conversation actually with Chris. I could talk to him for hours more about these sort of things, but in the spirit of trying to make sure I keep these conversations as concise and to the point as possible, we tried to keep it to around an hour. But I think you're going to like this. I think it ties a lot of the pieces that we've been going over together when you start to look at the historical context of property taxes, sales taxes, and income taxes, and how those three elements have all come together at once. Also worth noting is that there's an interesting layer between state government and local government and kind of what's been happening there over the years. So I think this is, if you care about this issue at all, and I know a lot of people do, I think you're going to really enjoy this conversation. All right, well, I'm glad to have with me today Chris Courtwright, who served for 34 years as the chief economist for the Kansas Legislature. And this is a position that advises and projects revenue numbers for the legislature so they can make budgeting decisions and tax decisions. And so Chris, for over 3 decades, has seen where the bodies are buried, and he knows how tax policy has evolved or devolved over the years. So Chris, thanks for coming in today.
Absolutely, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Well, I really appreciate you coming in on a relatively short notice, because we're working on a series about property tax. Seems to be all anybody wants to talk about, and there's good reason for that, because what people are telling us is that they feel like they're paying more in property taxes, and they're not wrong on a couple of fronts, right?
Correct.
Tell me what's happened with particularly residential property tax over the last 30 years or so.
Well, the last time the Kansas Constitution was amended relative to property taxes in a meaningful way was the early 1990s. And at that time, residential share of the property tax burden, in other words, the tax burden on houses, was about 35%. It was right around a third of the whole property tax base. The rest being commercial and ag land and oil and gas and public utilities and you name it. Most recently, we're approaching 2/3. It's going to be north. When I get my hands on the most recent year's data, it's going to be between 60 and 65%, I suspect. So it's gone over the last 30 years from 1/3 to 2/3.
So that amount has doubled basically over the last 30 years.
Absolutely. To the extent that property taxes, if they're validly levied by the people who need them, and the lion's share of property taxes, as we'll discuss in a minute, are levied by local units of government. It has gone from 1/3 to 2/3 of that tax burden falling on homeowners over the last 30 years. I guess there's a couple reasons behind that. One of them is there are more new homes built, more new residential parcels than there are new commercial businesses coming online, right? And there's only so much oil and gas in the ground, et cetera. But in some cases, you'll have a vacant lot one year, and then all of a sudden the next year there's a $300,000 or $400,000 house on it. So that's a big increase in residential value, right? For everybody else, it's okay. Here's a house that is valued last year at $200,000, but the appraiser thinks its valuation went up 5%, so now it's $210,000 this year, right?
Yeah.
So the growth of so that's how the growth of residential property is been high. Also, with respect to some of the other classes, you've got this wonky formula with ag land where values can go up or down depending on productivity averages and all those other things. But commercial, what happens, the heavy hitters when it comes to commercial property are able to get guys in Chicago wearing $1,500 suits onto an airplane and fly them in here to argue their valuation appeals in front of the Board of Tax Appeals, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's the income approach and there's the cost approach. And if I own the Westridge Mall in Topeka, the $27 million you guys have valued that at, maybe it only ought to be $12 million using this other approach. So that they get these heavy hitters to slug down their values, right? Not something Joe Sixpack can always avail himself of, although plenty of people do appeal their values every year.
But they don't have a team of lawyers who can go.
They don't have a team of lawyers or guys in $1,500 suits in Chicago who are going to get on an airplane for you.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other thing that happened that really accelerated this trend that's been going on for 30 years was the damn pandemic came along 5-6 years ago. And everybody discovered they could sit around and Zoom from home, right? And not have to go into work, and people could telecommute more easily and all the rest of this. So the value of residential property just skyrocketed, frankly, in the wake of the pandemic, right? So that certainly poured gas on the fire that was already burning. So in any case, at this point, more and more, the property tax is becoming more and more a tax exclusively on houses, right? Forget about the exemptions for some of the other classes of property that we can also talk about. The legislature has kept granting over the years that has further narrowed the tax base. But that's why it's become more noticeable to people. And we had a big property tax revolt in this state, and we can talk about the history of some of that if you guys want. In the late 80s and early 90s, when this current system we have now sort of came online. And it's property taxes have always been a contentious issue, but as you mentioned, Jason, it's really heated up in the last year or two. I've been traveling around the state the last 6 or 9 months, and I talk about a lot of things. I'll talk about income taxes or sales taxes, but the one talk I bet I've given it 6 times in the last 3 or 4 months, and I'm scheduled to give it 3 or 4 more times. People want me just to talk about property taxes. What the heck is going on? What are some of the solutions being discussed in Topeka? And why will they work or not work? And then what would I recommend? So believe me, I'm familiar with this whole talk that we're about to give.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of things that you talked about, and I want to give you a chance to talk about those. And I think it'll kind of set up the history a little bit. You mentioned ag values, and they are wildly different. Those are calculated wildly different than other property values. So I want you to talk about that a little bit. And then you talked about the kind of property tax revolt that happened in the late 80s, early 90s. And I want to make sure we talk to people about what was going on at that time that led to significant changes in the way we taxed property.
Yeah. Let's start with the ag land portion of that. Agricultural land is not taxed based on its fair market value, unlike most other classes of property. It's taxed based on its use value. or it's productivity. And there's this complicated formula that is applied statutorily, and it's the 8-year average of the 8-year average, and all this math goes into it. And in some cases, when farm prices are up and producers are having a good year, the values might be falling, but counterintuitively, if they're having a down year, their values might spike up because it's this wonky 8-year average thing. So that's an issue. As for how we got to this place, what had happened is the last time Kansas, before the late 1980s, the last time Kansas did a major reappraisal, sort of updating all property values, it happened from 1959 to 1972. It happened in waves, generally during the 1960s. And we think it's possible 3 counties didn't even reappraise at all in the 1960s, right? So you get forward to the 70s and the 80s, and you get mega inflation setting in, and housing values start to take off. And it's this wild, wacky system. And what happened is it was a badly outdated and endemically corrupt system that the courts were about to throw out. They were going to throw it out for not just violating uniform and equal, which is what the Kansas Constitution requires. They were going to throw it out for violating equal protection under the U.S. Constitution. It was a crooked, rigged crap scam. I don't want to minimize this. And let me go wonky for you a minute and tell you a term called a coefficient of dispersion was 40 in most cases for residential property. What that means is if you and I lived in identical houses right next door to each other, identical houses in identical condition, odds are one of us was houses was valued at 40% higher than the other one. Okay, that is how wild, because these values hadn't been updated since the 1960s, right?
Yeah.
And what was going on here is if the county appraiser was your brother-in-law or the county commissioner was your next door neighbor, you got a sweetheart deal. It was just this crooked, corrupt system, and it was going to get thrown out by the courts. So the legislature said, all right, well, look, we've got to update all values. We've got to go out and put fair market value on these properties. And we're going to pass this here. And we're going to give counties 3 or 4 years to go out and measure foundations of houses and do, all this new construction, all this stuff that we haven't done in 20 plus years. We're going to give from 1985 to 1989 to get this done. And the new system is going to kick in 1989. But then they realized at the same time, look, when we do this, wow, a lot of these values haven't been updated since 1968. So there's going to be some huge increases in values and shifts and all of this. We want to minimize some of the chaos that this is going to cause. So they put a property tax classification amendment on the ballot in 1986 that said, look, if voters approve this, this is going to kick in when the new values kick in 1989, right? And the voters said, yes, we like this because it set the residential value at that point at 12% fair market value. Commercial was at originally at 30. It had the special thing for ag land in there. All these different things. And what this classification amendment did that put these different levels in, it also exempted livestock and farm machinery. It gave the business boys some kind of a sweetheart deal on their business machinery and equipment with the straight line depreciation. It did a bunch of things, but it was designed in general to be a shock absorber, right? Mm-hmm. All this new value is going to come online because values hadn't been updated since the 1960s. My parents were living in a house in Johnson County that the county was probably valuing it at the same amount they had paid for it, 20 years earlier. It was just insane, the stuff that was going on. So the shock absorber was designed to, in the aggregate statewide, protect the shifts that were going to occur. They said, look, if homeowners were paying X percent of property taxes and they were X percent of the property tax base in 1988, when the new system kicks in with all these new values in 1989, we'd still like to see homeowners paying about X percent. Same way with commercial real estate. If it's paying Y percent, we think generally statewide they'll be paying Y percent. Okay.
Okay.
Ag land Z percent under the new formula Z percent. generally, we want everybody to keep paying what they are. Now, the shock absorber worked pretty well statewide. All right, it really did. But just because a shock absorber works really well statewide in the aggregate, remember we have 105 different counties with wildly disparate levels of residential and oil and gas and ag land and commercial property and all of that.
Yeah.
So just because it works statewide, we didn't get to put on 105 different shock absorbers. Okay.
Yeah.
So the bottom line is when the new system kicked in on January 1st, 1989, there were wild swings and shifts in tax rate. There were huge winners and losers. Now, anytime there's something dramatic that happens in terms of a big public policy change and there's big winners and big losers, the winners do not send you thank you notes, but the losers are enraged and energized at the ballot box.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
That's what happened. We had a statewide, we had a property tax revolt in Kansas that made national news. And as a result of that, that's one very important reason Governor Finney got elected, because in 1990, she basically beat two incumbent governors. She beat Governor Carlin in the Democratic primary in August of 1990. He was attempting a political comeback. He was running for a third term, which you're able to do in Kansas, so long as they're not consecutive. Okay. He was trying to political comeback in 1990, but he was governor when this stuff sort of came out, still governor in the mid 80s. And then, so she beat him in the primary, and then she beat Governor Hayden in the general election because he was Speaker of the House when this stuff went through, and then he was governor when it was all implemented.
Okay. And
she was sort of an outsider, a populist. She was state treasurer who couldn't be directly associated with these property tax changes that were pushed that had everybody so up in arms. So that's one interesting part of how we got Governor Finney. But the bottom line is 1989 and 1990, an asteroid really hit the earth in terms of this property tax revolt that hit here in Kansas.
What, when you say revolt, what did we have people refusing to pay their property taxes, or like really complaining to their county governments?
We had all of that. We had security problems at the State House. We had a special session. I mean, we have special sessions all the time anymore, but we only had between, I want to say 2014 and 1966, we only had like 2 special sessions in Kansas. Mm-hmm. And one of them was in 1989 because of property taxes. The courts, Peyton tried to issue an executive order to give people some relief, but it wasn't statutory, and the courts and the AG stepped in and said, no, you can't do this. So we had a special session in December of 89, and they tried to do some things, and then they came back in January in 1990 and tried to do some more, but it wasn't enough.
Yeah. And
so in 1990, besides Governor Finney getting elected, Democrats, for just the third time in state history, took control of the State House in the 1990 election. And then the other interesting part of this story is...
And that was a referendum. I want to be clear about that. That was a referendum. Democrats taking the House for the third time in the state's history was a referendum on property taxes and kind of the failures that had happened under previous administrations.
Absolutely, that was a very important part of what was going on. There were other things going on too. To be fair, Bush the elder was in the White House, and people were souring on him. Governor Hayden was not kind to people in urban and suburban areas, and didn't play nice with legislators from those areas. So it was sort of unpopular. So there are other things too, but the property tax was a huge, if not most significant, part of what had happened. So then what happened is the courts in that era, as now, were telling the lawmakers that you have to adequately and equitably fund your public school system, right? You have to meet a minimum standard, and you can't let Johnson County go off and have Gold Coast schools. And so you have to both adequately and equitably fund our public schools. So the early 1990s, the legislature gets to town. Again, Democrats are controlling the House, and I think the Senate was like 22-18 Republican. It was a lot closer than it is today. And Governor Finney's a Democrat, and a bit of a populist. And they all arrive in 1990 after the 90 election and the 91 session with this mandate to do something about property taxes, right? And also the courts are saying our public schools don't have enough money. So clever little devils that they were, they figured out a way after many months of meeting and making me do runs and all the rest of it. They figured out a way to solve both problems at once. What they did is they said, okay, we're going to take money, and that new money we're going to get from raising sales and income taxes, and then we're going to pump this new money out to the school finance formula. And in the vast majority of all cases, it's going to lower school property taxes. Okay. In 1991, in this state, mill levies ranged from school district general fund mill levies. Forget about other levies. Let's just talk about their general fund mill levies. That's what's currently 20 mills is their general fund levy. School district general fund mill levies ranged from 9 mills to 98 mills. The 9 mills was in Burlington, where they've got the Wolf Creek nuclear power plant, right? So they've got all that value.
Yep.
98 mills was in Parsons. Okay. So you had this wildly disparate system of 9 to 98 mills. And the new law said, okay, we're going to take all this money we're going to get from some sales and income tax increases, and we're going to pump it through the new formula, and no more 9 to 98 mills. Besides equalizing spending levels per pupil, like we're required to do, right? So we're going to begin to equalize tax burdens. So instead of 9 to 98 mills, everybody shall levy exactly 32 mills. The mill levy that's now 20, it's been lowered subsequently from 1992, but they said everybody shall levy exactly 32 mills. So in the vast majority of the then 300 plus school districts in the state, there was property tax relief provided. Okay, in some cases, huge property tax relief of 50 or 60 mills.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of the people who didn't get relief from this, it wasn't just Wolf Creek. The other people who had levies below 32 mills back in the day were a lot of the southwest Kansas counties where the Hugoton natural gas field is.
Yep.
If you go back and look at press clippings from 1992, 1993, when all of this kicked in, I don't know, 4 or 6 or 8 of those counties down there decided they wanted to try and secede from the state of Kansas and go join Colorado or something. It was a wild time all the way around.
This is part of the extension of the posse comitatus, right?
Yeah,
these guys were going to just move themselves. They were going to secede from the state of Kansas.
Yeah, that's when that got wound up. But that's when this 3 legs to the stool approach got to begin being discussed in terms of state and local finance. It was, okay, property taxes are higher than sales and income taxes. And if a 3-legged stool is sturdier than a 1 or 2-legged stool, so if we do this and raise sales and income taxes to use to lower property taxes statewide in the aggregate, all 3 are going to be about the same. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of a goal for policymakers had for about 20 years, from 1992 up until 2012, when, of course, a bunch of new people showed up who were much smarter than anybody who had ever preceded them. And they decided they were demanding to do major amputation surgery on what was then the shortest leg of the stool, which was the income tax leg. And we can talk more about that if we need to.
Well, I do want to get into that. So it's interesting, and I want to make sure we dwell on this a little bit. It's interesting that at the same time we're dealing with this property tax issue, we're dealing with the public education issue. That, if I remember right, that was the precursor to some of the ongoing. That was the creation of the funding formula that we kind of through extension still have today, right? It's changed over the years, but that was the first time where we created this sort of formula to make sure, because there were real issues. And you talked about in communities that had like 9 mills, those were wealthier communities that 1 mill raises a lot more money. And in communities that didn't have that wealth, they had extraordinarily high mill levies in an attempt to try to provide a decent education for those children. And effectively what happened at the time is said, we're going to create a system that equalizes that across the state and equalizes the tax burden so that you're not Wherever you are, you're paying basically the same in mill levy to your school district, right?
Exactly. And I've said this before in a lot of different talks that I've given. One of the things that I don't know that anybody's thought about this more than I have, at least no one in their right mind, but I think that the 1992 School Finance Act, most of which formulaically is still basically on the books today, it's the single most important piece of public policy that has been enacted in Kansas since the end of World War II. And I thought a lot about that, and I can't think of anything else that was more hard fought or more important in terms of shaping the future of the state.
Because profound changes across the state, and it touched everybody.
Absolutely.
So you talked about like that was kind of the philosophical North Star for the next 20 years or so until 2012. In 2012, around that time period, there did begin to be a distinct change in philosophy, and that has led, and I guess in my opinion, a lot of that change in philosophy and the policy changes that have come since then have led us to a place where the burden on homeowners and residential property taxes and the load on local government has increased. Can you talk about kind of some of the changes that have happened over the years that led to that? I guess that led us to where we are now.
Yeah, it's been unfortunate. A lot of before we get into what they did to the no longer emphasizing property tax relief, but instead became clinically obsessed about cutting income taxes in 2012. Before we get into the specifics of that, let me just say a lot of the policymakers who began showing up around 2010 and 2012 in Topeka had a different background before they got to the legislature than some of the people who were there when I started working for the legislature in the 1980s. If you go back, there was a lot more legislators who had been county commissioners or city council people or been on a school board or maybe run a business and had some kind of real life experience, but especially some in the public sector. But around 2010, 2012, some of the people showing up, they didn't have that background, I guess is the most diplomatic way to say it. They came straight off something they heard on TV or the internet, or straight out of their church pews, or they just came because it was time to do something, right?
Yeah.
And they didn't have the background, so they weren't as friendly to local units of government. They didn't have any sympathy for what goes on for local units of government. They didn't know some of the things I'm about to tell you. One of the things I'm about to tell you is that there are over 4,000 property tax levying subdivisions in the state of Kansas. It is a terrifying, crazy quilt of intersecting and overlapping local units. There are, 105 counties.
Uh-huh.
There are 627 cities. There's over 1,400 townships. We have community colleges, and we have many thousands of airport and library and water and sewer and cemetery and lighting districts. Okay. And they're all out there. Mm-hmm. And it is bizarre. It's this Byzantine system that's existed since the 1800s, literally in Kansas. But the idea that lawmakers, regardless of how well-intentioned they may be, can sit in a room at the State House in Topeka and sort of dictate tax lids and policies to some of these people who are locally elected, by the way, mm-hmm. It's a bit mystifying. I'm saying this as someone who served on a city council myself for a couple of years. One of the things that happened, and this predates by about a decade or so, the 2010 to 2012 period we're talking about, the legislature and the policymakers in Topeka have always known that property taxes are the most unpopular of the taxes, right? Surveys have been taken over the years, and everybody always wants to talk a good game when it comes to, we're going to cut your property taxes, right? Some of this is justified. People really do and are aggrieved of property taxes. But to be fair, some of it is property taxes. It's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. Okay, right? You have retired fixed income seniors whose mortgage is paid off, so their property taxes are no longer paid through escrow, right?
Yeah.
And they get a tax bill in mid-November, just before Thanksgiving, in the mail. First half of which is payable December 20th, by the way. Merry Christmas and thank you very much. And
I always wonder who made that decision. That seems like a bad time of year.
Yeah, it's been there forever.
Yeah.
And so, but because they're retired fixed income seniors, they've got more time to show up and berate their legislators at their Saturday morning eggs and issue coffees than does Joe Sixpack, who's at his kid's soccer game, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not saying there's not legitimate grievance that needs to, but lawmakers are always very concerned about property tax relief, especially property tax relief for the folks who need it the most. But one of the things, and so since the 1930s, the legislature had earmarked different pools of money, sales, and in the old days, cigarette tax receipts. Money would come into the state and it would go back out to locals through local ad valorem tax reduction fund and county city revenue sharing fund. This is money that went back out to all these taxing units I'm telling you about, except schools, because we handle schools differently because we're required to. But it didn't matter if you were a little recreation or watershed district or you were the city of Wichita, you shared in this pool of money that came out of the legislature every year, and it was out there since the 1930s. And sometimes in bad fiscal times, the legislature would cap the growth on these, but it always gave locals the money, and the money was required to be used for property tax relief to hold down the levy.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, what happened in after the 9/11 recession, right? Not the Great Recession, but the one before that, when the bad guys flew the airplanes into our buildings, right?
Yeah, in 2001.
2002, 2003, we had a really serious problem, and this recession hit Kansas harder than the nation as a whole because, hey, it was aviation manufacturing, as you can imagine, and airlines that were affected most by this. We had a hell of a mess on our hands for a couple years, and outgoing Governor Graves and incoming Governor Sebelius said, wow, we have to take these outgoing monies that we sent to locals since the 1930s, we have to suspend these just for a year. But then once we're out of the woods here, kids, we promise the money's coming back. Okay. That happened in December of 2002. And locals have yet to get a dime of that money. It has never come back. Okay. It just hasn't.
Yep.
So that's an issue and a problem, certainly, that the current group of policymakers just aren't as sympathetic to to locals and what's going on. The other thing that has happened is the lawmakers don't understand how property taxes work. They think, well, locals can just spend. We'll put slap a tax lid on them, and locals can just spend less money, and let's put this revenue neutral rate thing on them, and let's do all this stuff to them. Here's what they don't get. Let's say you're on the board of one of the most smallest, simplest one of these many thousands of local taxing units. Okay, let's say you're on the board of a cemetery district. Okay, and you don't meet every week if you're on the board of a cemetery district. You guys meet once a year, sometime in July, to set your budget, right? You have your annual meeting in July of your Ricky Rack little cemetery district out in the middle of nowhere, all right? And contrary to what these AstroTurf right-wing funded special interest groups tell you, they don't set mill levies in these meetings. They don't do it. They budget in terms of dollars. The mill levy is a computation that is made later in the fall, in October and November, by the clerks and the treasurers. The damn tax roll isn't even finally complete and certified in the summer when local units, I don't care if you're the city of Wichita or you're a cemetery district, when local units are setting their budgets in the summer, they only have estimates of assessed values to work with.
Yeah.
People are still appealing their values in the summer. They set their budgets in terms of dollars.
Based on what they think they're going to need in the next fiscal year.
Yes, it's dollars. And if you're a Ricky Rack little local cemetery district, you're sitting there saying, okay, we need $20,000 again this year because we have to pay this guy to put gas in his mower and mow the damn lawn at the cemetery. That's our budget. It's $20,000. Okay, it was $20,000 last year, and it's going to be $20,000 again this year. And they're sitting there year after year having the same meeting. They don't give a damn that the 2006 Kansas Legislature decided to take business machinery and equipment off of the tax roll.
Mm-hmm.
And if there happens to be any business machinery and equipment in the jurisdiction that is comprised in the local cemetery district, maybe last year it took 2 mills to raise that $20,000. This year it's 2.3 mills to get $20,000. That local cemetery district doesn't give a damn about what the legislature did. They still got to pay the guy to put gas in his mower and mow the lawn. So it's like a balloon that you tie up at a child's birthday party and squeeze. If you squeeze one side of the balloon, the other side gets bigger. Mm-hmm. 99 times out of 100, when you start messing around in property tax law, trying to give somebody or something or some class of taxpayers or type of property a break, all it does is squeeze the balloon and shift it to somebody else. Okay? Because you got to pay the guy to mow $20,000 to mow the lawn and put gas in his mower. That's just the way this works. And somebody more and more and more as the years have gone by is residential. The mill levies have got driven up. If you were a house in that hypothetical situation we just talked about, of all the mill levies that added up on your property, your local cemetery district was hitting you for 2 mills last year. They're hitting you for 2.3 mills this year because the legislature took machinery and equipment off of the tax roll. Here's my favorite tax-based narrowing story. In 2014, we're sitting there right in the middle of the failing brownback tax experiment. And it was failing. We are $800 million in the red ink and a national laughing stock. Our bond ratings are being downgraded. Every single year when the legislature is coming back into town, there's backfilling tax increases, painful budget cuts, and smoke and mirrors, eat your own seed corn budget gimmick on the table.
Even bonding long-term debt, 30-year long-term debt to fill a current budget hole, which we're still paying for today.
Oh yeah. No, the craziest stuff was on the table. But also 2014, if you'll remember, Jason, was an election year, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the state is broke, but they didn't have any candy to give out to the lobbyists, to their baby lobbyists, right? So they come into my office in 2014 and they say, and they couldn't afford any state tax cuts because we were already so far in underwater because the geniuses in 2012 had broken the bank with the failed tax experiment. So they come into my office in 2014 and said, Chris, look, we think we want to repeal the mortgage registration tax.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, what? You can't do that. It's not your money. It was a statutorily imposed tax. Counties got 25/26 of it, and some state heritage trust fund or some damn thing got 1/26 of it. But 25/26 of the mortgage registration tax went to counties, and because they got this ancillary source of revenue, they were able to not raise the regular property tax on people, right?
Mm-hmm.
So guess what they did? Right before the housing values spiked up, 4 or 5 years before the pandemic came here and all the rest of this, they repealed the mortgage registration tax because the Kansas Bankers Association was going to pack a bunch of money into their damn reelection campaign.
Yep.
Okay. Many hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of money that would have been used to hold down property tax levies is gone because they wanted the Kansas Bankers Association to send them a lousy $5,000 into the reelection campaigns in 2014. That's the kind of stuff that has happened.
I think people really need to understand that too, that they're, and we'll talk about this a little bit too, but I think I had a conversation with, actually I had a conversation with Mike Murphy, who I hope we'll talk about his plan a little bit too. But about how, if you have more money in Topeka to throw around, you tend to get your own way.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we've seen. You mentioned something that I remember very distinctly, and I want to make sure I let you go over this in a little more detail. The machinery and equipment exemption, and that happened in 2006. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I was working at the news at the time, and I remember that the cities talked about how devastating that was going to be and how much that was going to take away from local revenue. And if I remember correctly, there was something going on down in Coffeyville. Maybe they were rebuilding the refinery, maybe after a flood or something. And anyway, there was a lot of talk that was going to cost that local government so much money because we just basically created this giant sales tax exemption for rich industrial corporations.
Yeah, property tax exemption. Yeah.
Yep. Yes, and took that all off of the tax rolls.
Yes, and the history of that is it's something that the Kansas Chamber and the business boys had been wanting for some time. They already got us from 1989 till 2006. They had a sweet deal. They had this 7-year straight line depreciation for their business machinery equipment that was taxable, and they got what they wanted. But then some of the folks, especially Republican legislators who were around in the late 90s and early 2000s, kept throwing outright exemption bills into the hopper for it.
Uh-huh.
And finally, I think she saw the writing on the wall, but Governor Sebelius sort of jumped in line ahead of them, and she said, yeah, boy, they're right. I think we should do this. It'll boost eco-devo if businesses don't have to pay taxes on some of this stuff because they'll create jobs and retain jobs and all the rest of this. So she came out and proposed it back in the 2005, 2006 era. And I wasn't any happier when she said it than when the Republicans said it, because I said, guys, it's going to narrow the tax base. It's going to wipe out 8, 10, 12, up to 15%, depending on, your jurisdiction. And guess what's going to happen to mill levies and taxes on the homeowners? And so for a while, some of the people argued with me and said, no, that won't happen. They can just cut their budget. And I said, no, they can't. They have to pay the guy $20,000 to mow the freaking lawn at the cemetery. Nobody's going to cut their budget. So finally they said, oh, well, okay, Courtwright may have a point. So what we're going to do is we're going to create these slider payments, don't you know? And so what way this worked is when the business machinery and equipment exemption kicked in 2006, 2007, we're going to give locals back this pool of money, depending on how much machinery and equipment they had. We're going to give them back most of it kind of as an offset the first year, and then it's going to slide down over 5 years. It's going to slide away. That's why we're going to call them the slider payment. And by the time we're weaning locals from this replacement revenue source to prevent them from raising mill levies over the next 5 years, but by the time that has over 5 years, the economic growth from all of this will be so fantastic, don't you know, that it will, no one will even know anymore, right? We'll all be swimming in the great economic expansion here by 2010, 2011. Well, obviously that never happened, because just 2 years after that law was passed, along came the Great Recession, right? The housing bubble burst, the 2008, 2009 hit, and there was supposed to be 5 years of payments that locals got to help prevent the mill levy hike from losing all the business machinery and equipment valuation from the tax roll. And they were, if memory serves, they were going to get these payments every 6 months. So they were supposed to get a total of 10 payments over the next 5 years. I think they might have got one payment, the very first in early 2007 or something. And then boom, along came the Great Recession, and the legislature has another huge fiscal crisis on its hands, just like it did 6 or 8 years earlier during the 9/11 recession.
Mm-hmm.
So guess what the very first thing the legislature did to solve its own fiscal problems in 2008, 2009? They stopped immediately all slider payments, and nobody ever got another dime. So all this money that had been promised to, hey guys, we realize we're narrowing your tax base a lot. Here's money to make you feel better for a while, and then fingers crossed, all this economic growth is going to save us all. None of that money ever really went to local because wash, rinse, and repeat. The legislature just won't. At the end of the day, the very first thing they're going to cut is revenue sharing to local units. And as I've said, some of that is because they don't have as much sympathy for local units of government as some of their predecessors did.
Talk about, you've said a couple of times, the narrowing of the tax base, and I've talked about that, and I try to explain that, problems for a city, one of the problems for a city like Hutch and a lot of small rural areas west of here is this continuously shrinking tax base. And that you actually see some of your higher mill levies in towns that are smaller, counties that have lower populations, because there's so much less assessed valuation to tax from. And when you do things like the machinery and equipment exemption, you take that off, you're removing from property taxes. But like you said, that's taking off the assessed valuation. So you have a smaller assessed valuation, which puts demand on, if you want to try to maintain that budget, then you're putting more pressure on property taxes. But I have two questions that you said. One is about kind of explaining more of that narrowing of the tax base and why it's so important to address that. And the other is I found myself curious about how many times you've been told in your career that if we just did this exemption or we did this cut, that this magical thing will happen that never seems to happen, that all this growth will follow and you won't even miss. I mean, we've been promised that a number of times, have we not?
We most certainly have. I've been hearing that since literally the 1980s. And, again, we've launched on a great self-described experiment to try and do just that. We have heard this any number of times. And if it's worked even once, I'm all ears. I really am. As for the narrowing of the tax base thing, one of the things we need to do or could do is unsqueeze the balloon a little bit, right? Democrats have pushed a constitutional amendment to go on the ballot. Right now, residential property is assessed at 11.5%. So if you have a $100,000 house, its assessed value is 11.5%, and the mill levy applies to the $11,500. That's kind of the way the system works now. But because of some of these other changes in value and all these other things that have been happening, exemptions, everything else has been in the sweetheart deal that the ag land has, and the oil and gas boys have got some property tax exemptions, and all the rest of the stuff that has happened. Again, residential property has gone from 1/3 to 2/3 of the tax base. So to take back just a little bit of that, certainly not all of it, you can put a constitutional amendment on the ballot saying, hey, people of Kansas, in acknowledgement that you've been getting hosed compared to some of these biz boys over the last 30 years, why don't we put a constitutional amendment in front of you that would let you lower the assessment level on your houses from 11.5% to 9%?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now that would unsqueeze the balloon in a different direction and shift a little bit of the tax burden back onto commercial real, onto oil and gas, onto ag land, onto the public utilities, onto some of these people who have been the net winners the last 30 years as homeowners have picked up so much more of the burden.
Yeah.
And the people of Kansas, if given a chance to vote on that, I can promise you it would get 95% of the vote.
Yes, right? 100%.
That's never going to get on the ballot, Jason, and you know why it won't. Because the people of Kansas can't take the lawmakers to lunch. in
Yeah.
Topeka. That's the reality of it. So that's certainly one thing they could do. Another thing they could do and should do is give local units of government other arrows in their quiver. Everyone is upset about property taxes, right? I know you guys just recently had a sales tax election in Hutch that was approved.
Yep.
And one thing I will tell you is, again, this is something no one does except me, at least no one in their right mind. I sort of monitor local sales tax elections across Kansas and have for some decades. And it's not uncommon, 65, 70, 75% of local sales tax elections pass, right?
Yeah.
You think, well, people are anti-tax state. Why do we think so many local sales tax elections pass? It's because the public views them as a more attractive alternative to ever higher property taxes.
Yeah.
Right? That's just the reality of it. City council and county commissions, frankly, do a good job of making that point, right? If we have to rebuild the swimming pool in Hays, Kansas, right? Well, kids, it's going to be a $5 million property tax increase or a $2 million property tax increase and a quarter-cent sales tax that we'll put on the ballot. And if that gets approved, we'll only raise the mill levy 2 mils instead of 5 if the sales tax election passes.
Mm-hmm.
And the public thinks, ooh, boy, I'm a homeowner here in Hays, and 2 mils sounds like a lower number than 5 mils. And if this quarter-cent sales tax passes, I can export some of the tax burden for the new swimming pool on some of the truckers driving through here on I-70 buying a bag of potato chips. So yeah, I'm going to vote yes on the damn sales tax. That's the kind of reason you get to export some of the tax burden to other people. So the public generally says yes to sales tax. But the problem is our combined state and local sales tax rates have gotten really, really high in this state. You've got the 6.5% state rate, and you've got all these add-on city and county taxes now. The combined rate in most cities in this state is well above 10%. Okay. And we just about fished this well dry, right? And yes, it's great. We took at least the state sales tax off of groceries. But it is, we still tax prescription drugs, non-prescription drugs and feminine hygiene products and diapers. We tax plenty of things that are
essential. Yeah.
Hard on the poorest among us. And by the way, do you know the reason that the legislature and at Governor Kelly's urging left the local sales tax on groceries? It's because of property taxes.
Yeah.
Right? The legislature knew, okay, here's the fiscal note. We got the fiscal note for Chris Courtwright. We know what it's going to be to take the sales tax off of groceries, and we've got this money laying around. We can just eat this at the state level or, cut programs or whatever we need to do. We've got our own budget here at the state level. But it's 15% of the tax base. If we wipe out 15% of the cities and counties' sales tax base, guess what they're going to do to mill levies, right?
Going to jack them up, yeah.
So they left the locals the ability to tax groceries because nobody wanted to deal with even more wrath and angst from property taxpayers. So long story short, the property taxes make up about 80% of all local revenue.
Mm-hmm.
Cities, counties, school districts, watershed districts, the whole, and of the other 20%, probably 17% of it is sales tax. Okay, and the rest are just little rats and cats. Used to be the mortgage registration tax, but they had to repeal that one back in 2014 because the bankers wanted it to, right? But unlike the state, the local units of government don't have income taxes or earnings taxes or severance taxes or liquor taxes or cigarette taxes or motor fuel taxes, right? They don't have any of those other options. So one of the things that the League of Municipalities and the Kansas Association of Counties always used to do, but they finally gave up about 10, 12, 15 years ago, back in the 80s and 90s, they would say, give us liquor enforcement tax authority, give us motor fuels, give us cigarette taxes, give us incomes or earnings taxes. Let us ask our voters, just like we do on the sales tax, let us put this on the ballot to see, hey guys, as an alternative to us always raising property taxes, would you be willing to impose a cigarette, liquor, or earnings tax? It's your call, voters. Just give us this authority. And of course, the Republicans would never even hear the bills, let alone move them out of committee. But if locals had other arrows in their quiver, I think the public would approve some of these other options as alternatives to ever higher property taxes.
And so it's an interesting thing. The legislature kind of they kind of hamstring local governments through taking things off the tax base, taking money away for like the LATV money. Yeah. But then they are also unwilling to relinquish the control of allowing cities to manage their own affairs and raise their own funds and be creative in that endeavor. Even to the point where I saw sometimes in the legislature where a city or a county would have to come and ask us for approval before they could put a sales tax on the ballot above 1% or above a certain percent. Yeah. The legislature wants to keep that control, but also dictate then to counties and cities what they have to do.
Yeah, and pat city and county governing bodies on the head and send them out to battle against a mob of angry property taxpayers with one hand tied behind their back because there's nothing else they can do other than a property taxes, because they got to pay the guy to mow the lawn, they got to fix the roads, they got to do these other things. And one of the things that they're considering now that would make things even worse is at least what was approved by the Senate. It's now in conference committee, these property tax valuation cap scheme, sort of the Kansas version of California's Prop 13. They've been trying to push this out of the Senate for the last 6, 7, 8 years. It's a 3% valuation cap. And it sounds great. And if you put it on the ballot, voters will probably vote for it thinking it'll help them, and it won't. At the end of the day, it just won't provide any meaningful relief for people. What it will do is if the county appraiser thinks my house is going up 9% a year, and I get the valuation notice in March that he thinks my house went up 9%, I'm mad, and I show up and I yell at my legislator on a Saturday morning in March. But now if the law says you can only raise the value on Chris's house 3%, I'm not as mad, so maybe I don't berate my legislator, right? But what happens when locals go to set their budgets in the summer, there's less valuation growth. So guess what happens to mill levies?
The mill levies go up.
Other than on the fixed school finance levy of 20 mills, I'm still going to pay the same amount of dollars in taxes because we got to pay the guy to mow the lawn. It's just the levies have been driven up to get you there now. And guess what? What is the one thing on God's green earth that people hate more than property tax on their house? You know the answer to that?
I don't know.
The one thing on God's green earth they hate worse than property tax on their houses is property tax on their cars.
On their cars, yes.
On their cars.
Every year, over and over again.
And the car tax is based on the countywide average mill levy.
Oh, yeah.
Tom Sawyer did a run last year. If we put this stupid thing on the ballot and it passes, within 2 years, we could have a 27% increase in everybody's car tax.
I did not realize that because that's gonna see the mill levy, that valuation cap will potentially, most likely, based on what you've told us tonight, increase the mill levies, and that then is tied into the car automobile taxes.
Absolutely. It would skyrocket car taxes. And besides the fact that doing this and suppressing value and giving certain property a tax break, it would do in Kansas what it's done in California. Over time, it sets up a landed aristocracy. And if you think young 28-year-olds can't afford a house in this state now, do something like this. It will make the housing crisis and shortage that much worse.
Tell us what happens in California, because you've talked about this before, and it feels like a good idea to cap valuation increases, but they've had some real issues in California with this, right?
Oh, my heavens, yes. Yeah, it is unbelievable. Listen, I couldn't even begin to get you started on the whole Prop 13 and the wild inequities that have existed there. If you owned property in California in 1978 when this kicked in and got your values rolled back to 1975, and then they could never grow more than 2% a year unless you were a new homeowner, and then we're going to soak you at full fair market value. It's a welcome stranger, hello stranger taxation scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And well, all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, who almost threw it out in 1992. But no, it is the most wildly inequitable. And California is now passing laws that says stuff like, they have since then, if a property is handed off to a trust fund, or it goes from one generation to the next, or from your grandparents, the ownership of the house really doesn't change. We're going to let you wink, keep the sweetheart deal you got on your valuation back to 1970 levels. It is lunacy. And if we did this in Kansas, the problem is it would be in some cases great for senior citizens, right? To not be angry about this. There's other ways we can address their angst. But one of the things politicians in Kansas have been talking about literally since I was in college is the brain drain, right? And how Kansas is demographically challenged. We are older nationwide than the demographic nationwide. We want more of our regents, graduates to stay in the state. We want to attract more young people. We want more 28-year-olds with 2.4 kids to move into the state of Kansas and work at the battery plant by DeSoto, right? So they can pay taxes, because I'm going to have to go to the nursing home in a few years, right? So we want more of that, okay? But if you do this, the mill levy is driven up. If we're just going to start soaking the new people at full fair market value, the 28-year-olds aren't going to be able to afford to move in here, okay? It is the Right of Center Tax Foundation says, don't do this. This is horrible, poorly targeted. There's a lot of other ways you can provide property tax relief, targeting the seniors or whoever you're trying to help. Don't do this. The Right of Center Tax Foundation says, do not do this. The Kansas Association of Realtors, also nobody's liberals, by the way, say, do not do this. It'll distort the hell out of real estate market. There's just a whole bunch of reasons not to do this. But try to tell that to Dave Trabert and some of the people in the Kansas Senate who've been trying to get this on the ballot in recent years. It remains to be seen how this is going to play itself out.
Yeah. And it's only got one hurdle left clear, right? Like you said, it's in conference right now. So even by the time this airs, which will be probably 2 Thursdays from now, it could be passed. It could be sent out and scheduled to go on the ballot this year.
It could. Now, the House has sort of killed this 2 years in a row, and they have their own version that isn't quite as bad, but who knows what's going to come out of one of these 3 a.m. conference committees.
Yeah.
So
there's a lot of things that went into conference in the dark of night that came out looking a lot different in the morning that people don't really understand.
For 6 years, I can attest. Yes, a lot of odd things happen at the State House at 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning.
Oh yeah. So tell me, what sort of things you talked about giving local governments more tools to work with. We've talked about maybe the history of the legislature not giving away, exemptions and tax credits and all that, of which there's approaching $12 billion of that on the books every year. What other tools? I know we have some for seniors, and I want to really talk about what I have always viewed as my favorite solution, the homestead tax credit rebate program, which I think could just be expanded and modified without creating a new program or changing the underlying system very much, but we could actually make some progress with that. But what sort of tools are there, or could we have that would be more helpful on this property tax issue than some of the things that are currently in play?
That's the biggest one. You just mentioned the so-called circuit breakers. The homestead program has been on the books since the 1970s. And the way it works is because we don't want to squeeze the balloon and give tax cuts to seniors or anybody else and drive up mill levies on everybody else and their car taxes and all the rest of it, you go ahead and pay your taxes, and your school district collects your property taxes, and your cities and your counties and your cemetery districts, everybody else. You pay your property taxes. And then you prove when you file your income taxes that you paid your property taxes on time, and we're going to give you back part of your property tax, right? If you're a fixed income senior, if your income is below a certain level and someone in your household is above age 55, or blind, or disabled, or a dependent child under age 18, right? So we single moms as well as the seniors and the disabled Kansas and all the rest. If you meet the income and the demographic test, at least one person in the household with one of those four things, we're going to make you eligible for the homestead program, okay? And give you back part of your property taxes in acknowledgement that you need some property tax relief. We can throw more money at that program. Now, one of the dumb things we did, for many, many years, renters were allowed to participate in the homestead program. The assumption was that 10 or 15% of the rent you pay goes to your landlord and is attributable to property taxes he's passing along to you through the lease agreement, right? Mm-hmm. Virtually the lion's share of the states that have these circuit breaker programs let renters participate for that very reason. Okay, in the 2012, one of the ways that the former governor wanted to pay for his income tax cut for the uber wealthy was to kick renters out of the homestead program, which they did. They were kicked out 13 years ago, and they haven't been put back in. It is criminal that we don't allow renters to participate in the homestead program. There's 2 or 3 other programs now. There's something called the Safe Senior Program, and there's a new one that former Senator Holland got enacted a couple of years ago before he left the legislature. It's a freeze program. If your house is below, I can't remember, but $350,000 or $400,000, and your age, whatever it is, 60 or 62 and above, and your income isn't too terribly high, then a base year. You pay your taxes, and we're effectively going to freeze your taxes by giving you bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger refunds every year. It effectively freezes your property taxes. We have that on the books now. We could enhance the hell out of it. We could throw, we've got money laying around for tax cuts. We could throw money at that and enhance these different circuit breaker programs.
When you and I were working together, one of the things that I had you work on was expanding the homestead rebate program, right? And we did financial analysis, and if memory serves, I don't think that was going to cost. Well, it wasn't going to cost too awful much to increase the income threshold on that, because the income threshold on that is on the homestead is really low. It's like 35,000 or something like that.
Right.
But yeah, those systems are in place. Why do you think there's no will to improve or enhance those programs?
I honestly don't know, because that's how you buy off the revolution. If you just do a valuation cap, or you lower the 20 mils, or any of these other ways they've been trying to provide property tax relief, you're giving some of the relief to people who don't need it. The statutory programs are targeted by design to people. You have to be above a certain age, or you have to be blind or disabled, or have dependent children in the house, and you have to have income below a certain level. And if you've got a $700,000 house, we're not giving you any property tax cuts. So there's been some thought tailored into these kinds of people. If your house is $350,000 or less, and you're not a millionaire, and you're 62, we're going to give you back some of your property tax. They've tailored it specifically. But the stuff they're pushing now, I think it's kind of a cruel hoax. They want to put something on the ballot so they can tell people we're doing something for property tax relief, and all it's really going to do is hamstring future generations some of these valuation tax schemes. And the House did something really bad late last week. Their version of the constitutional amendment that's now in conference committee, and maybe it never comes out of conference committee, I don't know. But the House had this kind of thing where you can use a multi-year average to limit your value increase somehow. But they put an amendment on that was totally bogus and doesn't belong in there, and said the legislature can exempt the valuation increases or exempt senior property taxes altogether if they want to. Well, the legislature kind of has that authority now.
Yeah.
But this just explicitly says, forget about the damn circuit breaker programs. We're going to walk away from them and quit funding them. We're just going to tell seniors, if you own a house above age 55, you don't got to pay any property tax. Guess what that's going to do to mill levies and taxes on 28-year-olds and car taxes on everybody? They're going to put, and by the way, it's not self-executing. If they put that on the ballot, none of that could happen until they figure out what they can afford to do and not do. They'd have to pass implementing legislation in 2027, even if they put that on the ballot and it passes. But yet they're going to put that on the ballot and tell people that this is going to provide you property tax relief when it won't literally do anything because there won't have been any implementing legislation enacted yet. It's just a cruel hoax so they can trick people into thinking that they're providing them meaningful property tax cuts, which they are not. They haven't in 2 or 3 or 4 years now, even during this most recent era that we've discussed when people are in arms, especially homeowners, over property tax.
Yeah. Do you feel that I'm glad you said that, but do you feel over the last several years, as there's been more pressure and more attention and more people complaining about property tax, that the legislature has largely just flirted around the edges of this? They're not really taking a hard dive into trying to address the problem. There's a lot of fringe ideas that don't provide either meaningful relief or structural change to the system.
Yeah, I guess I have two answers to that. The first one is, yes, they embrace these fringe things that sound good and don't do anything meaningful, right? They're just trying to blind them and bluff them with these faux solutions that don't really do anything. But at the same time, as people are more and more angry, some of the people behind the legislature don't mind that, because as the public is more and more aggrieved, it builds contempt for the public sector at all levels. If more and more people are really irritated at their county commission, at their city council, at their county appraiser, all the rest of this, then the AstroTurf groups are burrowing down into local levels of government now, right? They started getting into school boards because of public being upset over COVID and the pandemic, and they're going into they're fueling grievances at the local level now, and they're burrowing down in there and they're going after locals, and I don't know that the lawmakers really care about that, because that's what the policy institutes want to do now. That's just my own opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it feels that there's more money and more resources being thrown at local governments to try to create discontent there, and it feels like it's an effort to just create dysfunction at every level of government.
Yes,
there was something else you had talked about earlier about, and I want to make sure I come back to that. You talked earlier about the three-legged stool. And this is the idea that taxation is best if it's balanced between 3 different streams. And in Kansas, that is income, sales, and property tax. And as you mentioned, property tax is largely what funds local operations. To a different degree, sales tax and income tax fund state operations. But in my view has always been that part of the reason there's so much pressure on property taxes is because of the significant changes to income tax structure over the years. And there's been a lot of corporate pressure, and you and I talked about it, the money in politics is transcends party, and it's one of the things that affects policy The more money you have, the more you get your policy. And that's just how that works. And it's unfortunate, but it has real world consequences in that people with money have the money to get their income tax liability reduced. And then whenever local government and state government, even some level of federal government, is looking for ways to finance their operations, it falls on us to pick up that slack because we're not rich enough to have lobbyists employed for us.
Yeah, on the whole three legs to the stool thing, Jason, a couple observations. Let me tell you a story about 1986, 1987. This is not long after I started working for the state. There was a very bad regional recession that happened. And if you look up at national recession, you won't see one in 86, 87, but there was a very bad regional one. And oil and gas, agriculture, aviation, manufacturing, that's sort of the three key sectors of the Kansas economy were all really in the dumpster at once. Mm-hmm. And this is hard to believe today, but it's especially energy driven. Oil was down as low as $9 a barrel, and gas was 50 cents per MCF at the wellhead.
Wow.
As as that may be. And so it hit Kansas and Oklahoma and Texas and a lot of these states really, really hard. Okay, this regional agriculture, oil and gas kind of recession. And we had bad times here in Kansas. In 1987, I can remember Senator Feliciano almost crying out on the Senate floor because we had to enact rescissions in budgets that they had passed back in 1986. They had to cut budgets mid-year when money had already been appropriated, and they had to claw back money. It was painful stuff that we had to do here in Kansas, okay? But as bad as it was here in Kansas, it was far, far worse in Texas. It took them 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years to recover from it. And the reason is, Texas, as we know, and this always gets thrown in our face, does not have an income tax. They get all their money from severance taxes and sales taxes, right? And their revenue portfolio is not as balanced and diversified. Okay, so they've got all their eggs in fewer baskets, kind of thing.
The severance tax is like on oil and gas, right?
Yeah,
yeah.
So that happened when oil went to $9 a barrel and gas to 50 cents per MCF. First thing you know, gleaming office buildings in Houston and Dallas are kicking guys in $900 suits out, and they're out on the streets. And then they're not spending money because they just lost their job because their oil services company closed, right? Mm-hmm. Well, pretty soon, no one's spending any money, and the oil rig workers out in Western Texas aren't working, and the whole thing just collapsed on itself because nobody had any money to spend, and they get all the rest of their money from sales taxes. So this hit really, really hard in Texas. And so Kansas was cognizant of this in the early 90s when we were putting in this new way of thinking about things is, well, if we're more balanced, if our revenue portfolio is more balanced and diversified, 3 legs to a stool are sturdier than a 1 or 2-legged stool, mm-hmm. and they can survive economic windstorms better if your revenue portfolio, and that's true. So that was an important part of the thinking. Another part of the thinking involves equity issues. If you've got 3 healthy legs to your state and local finance stool involving income, sales, and property, at least one of them is progressive in the income tax, where the wealthier tend to pay a little bit more, right? Mm-hmm. One of them is regressive. It's the sales tax, right? And we know about regressive being the hardest on the poorest among us. And then the property tax is kind of sort of somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah.
The wealthier you are, the more property you tend to own. And sure, we can have conversations about everybody should be entitled to live in a home and all the rest of this. But so you've got one kind of balance there on the 3-legged stool. And another one is if you, as I said, you've got a balanced and diversified revenue portfolio and you cast your net broadly, odds are no matter who or what you are, you're going to have some skin in the game, right? if you're a college student, those doggone college students aren't paying us much income taxes, but at least we're getting them with the sales tax and the property tax on their 15-year-old car, right?
Uh-huh.
If you're a manufacturing business, we may give you every sales tax exemption known to mankind, but at least if you're profitable, we're going to get you with the income tax, boys. Okay. So no matter what kind of entity you were, you probably had some skin in the game if you've really got a broad base on all three major tax sources. But this lunacy that came along in this way of thinking in the 2012 tax law, where the only kind of income we're going to tax anymore is wage income from Joe Sixpack. And if you're a dentist or a lawyer or a real estate agent and you set up your business as an LLC shell, you don't have to pay us any income taxes anymore, state income taxes anymore, boys. Forget about the fact that Koch Industries had God knows how many LLC subsidiaries that weren't paying us any income taxes at that point. Talk about that. But and then they came crying to me why we were $700-800 million in red ink. I mean, it's clear that it was crazy what they did. And then finally, as you'll remember, in 2017. After 5 years of this, the fiscal crisis had become ongoing and institutionalized, right? Everyone would come back to town. Every year there would be backfilling tax increases on the table, which we had to enact backfilling tax increases in 2013, 15, and 17 after this disaster in 2012. There were painful budget cuts. And then these smoke and mirrors, let's quit making payments let's rob the Bank of KDOT blind. And let's quit making payments that we're required to make into the state pension program, the Capers program. Yeah, let's do all this other penny wise and pound foolish stuff one of my favorite ones was, sometimes when somebody will like win a lottery and they get out over their skis and they have like an annuity.
Uh-huh.
And so Lloyd's of London and some of these people will come in and say, you know how you're supposed to get $25,000 a year for the rest of your life, but now you've run up 75 grand in credit card debt. I tell you what, we'll give you 100 grand right now, no questions asked. You just go ahead and sign over your 25 grand for the rest of your life to us. Okay. There's an industry that does this.
Yeah.
Well, Kansas, one of the things that Brownback and some of his people wanted to do, Kansas gets like 61 million or 59 million. It's gone down a little bit, depending on the number of packs sold. Kansas gets $61 million a year in perpetuity from the tobacco industry because of a settlement that the state attorneys general got in the late 1980s with the tobacco industry. Because the tobacco industry lied like damn rugs throughout the 50s and 60s and all the rest of it and covered up their own medical evidence and all this other stuff. And they were going to lose their asses in court.
Yeah.
The state attorneys general said, okay, boys, no harm, no foul, but we'll agree not to go all the way with you on this one. If you agree that you did some wrong stuff and you just pay us $60-odd million a year here in the state of Kansas until the earth ends. In other words, if earth lasts 20,000 more years, Kansas would have got $60 million a year and still will from the damn tobacco industry because of all the social costs associated with people smoking who, but blah, blah, blah. You know the reasons. Well, some of Brownback's minions one of these Lloyd's of London or these people wanted to come in here. Hey, boys, we know you're hundreds of billions underwater because of your failing tax experiment. We'll give you 300 million right now if you sign over to us the rights to $60 million a year until the earth ends. That was one of the things they wanted to do.
I remember the comparison to J.G. Gentworth. Do you remember those commercials?
Yeah.
It'd be like,
that's the I'm trying to think of.
Yeah, it was cash. It was cash now. Like you need cash now.
It's my money. I want it now.
Yeah, exactly. I remember those. But and that money is used primarily to fund early childhood programs.
Absolutely. We use the money.
Yeah, and it's worth saying that money then is offsetting what would be other state money that would go in it to fund those programs. So
Absolutely, there's no free money.
yeah, at the time they were going to trade that off just to get a one-time settlement. I remember the nearly $1 billion, or maybe even more than $1 billion, that was bonded. Didn't we? We bonded $1 billion of debt, put it into KDOT. Long-term debt, not short-term debt, long-term debt. We bonded.
Boys, how's that taste?
Yeah. Put that $1 billion into KDOT and then immediately swept most of that money back out to backfill the budget. I mean, if you were, for as many times as I hear, well, you should run government like a business or run it like a household. I don't know how anyone thinks it makes sense to bond. I mean, if this is mortgaging your house so that you can buy your kids a nice dinner tonight, right? Yeah. I mean, it's the dumbest thing in the world, and it was done. And you helped produce for years these fiscal facts, Kansas fiscal facts, which was always one of my favorite things, still is one of my favorite things to look at. And I remember shortly after that, I'd watch the per capita debt load in every other state. So the amount of debt the state carries for every man, woman, and child in the state, I'd watch it drop in all of our neighboring states, but not in Kansas. We still carry in the neighborhood of $1,500 debt per capita, and most of it's from that period in time.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that we did, again, we did not sell our rights to the tobacco settlement, thank goodness, but a lot of this stuff, what you just described, we did. We were sweeping couch cushions for any dopey eat your own seed corn kind of temporary fix we could get to bail us out of the tax experiment. And we enacted backfilling tax increases for all these income tax cuts that most of which were around, some of which are, the rates still aren't what they were, but even the people who got their 4-year income tax break on all non-wage business income, that was paid for. There were 2 sales tax increases enacted in 2013 and 2015. There were
one of which was supposed to be temporary.
Yeah. There were all sorts of backfilling tax increases that they had to pass with only Republican votes, by the way. And some of the Republicans were not happy about that. There's a famous picture of former Representative Whitmer literally crying at the wall of the House after he'd been instructed to vote for the bill by Governor Brownback.
It's a very, very, very well circulated photo, isn't it? I'm glad you brought that up because I never miss a chance to remind people that the sales tax should have and was supposed to be 1.5% lower than it is currently. It was never that 6.5%. It was supposed to go back. They passed the increase, and there was a temporary increase that was, well, it wasn't a temporary increase. It was a temporary not reduction that then became a permanent increase. But yeah, everything you buy should have less sales tax on it, and it doesn't because of that very period in time. And all of this goes to, because I kind of want to pull it together, and I could talk with you for probably 6 hours in a setting about these issues and download this history, but I kind of want to pull it together here. That what it all comes down to, I think, is important to talk about is, like, for me, there's 2 main things I always get when I talk to you. One is that the sort of interconnectedness between all these different policy decisions. I think that we have, and we like the world to be simple and easy, and it's not. These things are all connected, and your analogy of the balloon is so great because you squeeze it one place, it gets bigger somewhere else. You release the pressure on one group of people, another group of people tend to pick up the slack. And the other is just the history of this, that if you can zoom out of the moment and take a longer view of how we got here, this isn't just a 3 or 4 year problem. There have been decisions made over a very long period of time that have created the conditions that led us to this moment right now.
Absolutely, Jason. I couldn't say it better. And the only other thing I might add is the balloon analogy usually works with audiences. The other one that's associated with it that I sometimes use, and it is along the lines of, if you exempt somebody, you give somebody favorable treatment, what it does to everybody else. And that is, the more horses you unhook from the wagon, the remaining horses have to pull the wagon harder.
Yeah.
That's the other analogy that sometimes you get people seeing a little light bulb going on over their heads.
And right now, and for the last several years, the horse that's pulling the wagon is residential property taxes.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Chris, I'm really thankful that you took some time to go through this with me. You know that I'm going to want to talk to you again because this is not an issue that's going away. And I'm looking to get you to come to town sometime over the summer. I started looking at some dates today. So we'll get you into town so you can do this live and talk with people here in Hutchinson and the surrounding area about so they can learn a little more about the history of this taxation and policy in the state.
You got it, my friend. Always happy to come to Hutch.
All right. Thanks, Chris. If you find the content that we're producing useful, helpful, compelling, interesting, entertaining, or just a good part of your day at all, please consider following us at thatguyinhutch.com or liking and reviewing us on Apple and Spotify. I want to thank a few of my friends who are really important to the podcast. Jenny Burgett designed my logo for me. My son Mitchell has written the intro music. And of course, Christopher Acker sits in the studio with me every week and makes me sound good.
A Salt City Sound production.